Alrighty, welcome back to Chords of Curiosity. Here we are in Palm Springs, California, and I'm with two Australians. I've got Mike Nayna and Brett Hall. What's up, you guys?
Excited to be here. Very hot, dealing with the temperature. As Australians,
yeah,
like
as Aussies, I thought we'd be able to take it, but it's hotter here than it is back home.
the intensity of the sunlight, for whatever scientific reason, is greater here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this conversation is hopefully going to be about the culture war and its relationship between memes and culture. Brett's, an expert in David Deutsch and Popper, and Mike, give a little background about what you do with your Substack and everything.
I guess it centers on the academy. A lot of the investigations I'm doing are around the sociology of knowledge. So how the academy affects the culture at large, how a lot of the culture is downstream from the academy, and how the Great Awakening, which is moving into a new phase now, it was very much a product of certain disciplines that were taking place in the academy. And so I looked at those disciplines and studied the ideologies, and I just found it interesting from a philosophical perspective, from the sociology of knowledge. And I think that's probably where we might get some traction between your background and mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they say politics is downstream from culture, but where does, what influences culture? The academy is huge, and we want, ideally, a high quality academy to be able to solve problems, intellectual and practical problems. But that seems, with your work with the reformers, you've kind of shown how not high quality the academy has become.
Yes, yeah. There's a social problem inside the university which has created epistemological problems downstream, you would say. And so it is interesting, because if you've got a background in Deutsch and Popper, they have. Forgive my ignorance about their work as well, so we might not get that much traction on that, because these are very. This is
the time to learn.
these are thinkers with a broad range of thoughts, and so I know like small sections of them, but I definitely haven't had a deep dive into either of their work. But my understanding is that Popper, in particular, has some theories on how to create better memes, would you say?
He doesn't talk much about memes. Certainly Deutsch does, building on what Popper has to say. And you're talking about ideology, like Peter Bukosian often talks about ideological capture. And certainly that's the situation we're going through right now. But I wonder if it's a cycle, because you talk about how culture is upstream of, let's say, politics. Further upstream of culture, I would contend, is philosophy. That the philosophies that people adopt, whether they know it or not, are the things that are going to drive their behaviour and therefore create a culture within an institution. And so we've had situations before in the academy where relativism, postmodernism has taken hold. And it seems to have gone through a similar thing again now, as if it's cyclical. I don't know about yourself, but I started university in sort of the mid-90s, and it was just beginning then, this new wave, or some kind of new wave of the centrality of relativism. And so I went along, for example, I took a subject in the history and philosophy of science, thinking I'd get the history and philosophy of science, but I got nothing of the sort. I got
power dynamics.
Yeah, it's all about, well, this was discovered by white men, so therefore it's one way of looking at the physical world, the chemical world, the biological world, as if there was no truth there. So, but I don't think it's the first time. I think that, back in the 60s, it was a similar sort of a thing, and somehow people escaped from it and fell back into it. I don't know if you're seeing the same sort of thing in your work, that there's these cycles.
I think it's a continuation. It's like herpes. It goes and hides in the little corner of the academy, and then when the civilizational system is weak, the whatever Marxist variant comes, and you get sores all over over the culture. And so I do believe it's a continuation of it's Marxian. So you don't really want to say it's Marxist. I think that's the wrong way of putting it, just because Marx was so focused on economics. It's a pure focus on economics. But the lineage coming from Marx, coming from his idea of ideology, the bourgeoisie ideology, dictating how people have false consciousness and so on and so forth. He was foundational to those ideas. And then you get that picked up by Gramsci, who I guess doubles down into the cultural aspect of it, and is less focused on the economics of it all. And then through him, you get Frankfurt School, you get the cynical theories, you get post-colonial theory. It's a problem in Australia, we would say, because of the Aboriginal connection. You get queer theory, which is the sexuality component, very Foucault heavy, Judith Butler. Foucault through to Judith Butler into all sorts of crazy people who are cutting their genitals off. And then you've got, what was the third one? Critical race theory, which also enters into the Australian context in very strange ways. But
that's the thing that most upsets me. Critical race theory, specifically because, I'm a proponent of critical rationalism.
Yeah.
And so my understanding of criticism is the way in which you actually make progress, objective progress, and the way in which you improve ideas is by criticizing. But the weird thing about all those things that you mentioned, what they share in common, is actually an anti-critical attitude. They hold themselves immune from criticism. And if you dare, within the academy, criticize one of these sacred cows, critical theory, whatever it happens to be, then we've seen it, and this is exactly what your work is about. People get cancelled, so it creates a culture of silence and anti-criticism.
Well, that's your perspective of criticism is criticism from a point of, would you say, an attempt at objectivity. I think the critical theories are, by design, not an attempt at objectivity. They criticize on behalf of a certain group and a certain culture, and so if you're criticizing the power from the perspective of the powerless. And so in some sense, there are aspects of this where you get, what would you say, like traction with reality, because there are powerful people and there are people suffering underneath their interests. But what you get here is, over time, it's so fixed, it's such a fixed perspective that you're criticizing on behalf of an ideological paradigm. So this is where you get intersectionality. If intersectionality is a concept where I can experience oppression from many different, what would you say, perspectives. So, but the perspectives are linked to some kind of identity. So if I'm a woman, I have a certain kind of experience of the world, which of the powerful. And I have to critique from that perspective. Or if I'm a gay woman, that means I've got a double vision of the power, the power elite, and then so on and so forth, right down to if I'm a left-hander as opposed to a right-hander. It's a very interesting how liquid this perspective has become into critiquing the powerful. And so when we're looking at the past, we're looking at an ideology with a kind of a cumbersome identity block, which you would say is the proletariat, who are squashed underneath the powerful capitalists. But now we have an intersectional framework where we've got predictable, unfortunately, identities that converge. So it's gay, black, trans is a big one. Trans makes you quite holy in this perspective, because you've got all the vision of the power elite. But it's ideological in that it's a specific worldview and it's fixed. And so when they mean critical, they mean I'm critiquing the world and the power systems from this fixed ideological perspective. It's not everyone experience the world and then try to critique it on the basis of some attempt at objectivity. It's not that at all. And they say that. The early critical theorists are quite open about the fact that this is about changing the world, not describing it.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in postmodernism, which, I think Popper solves better. The problems postmodernism, potentially attempts to address is like the, interpretation of the world. There is like an infinite, potentially, interpretations of sense data that we get there, but we have interpretations that we just make up. postmodernists might say, and Popper would also, and Deutsch would say, it's just, it's not arbitrary though, what we make up, because once we make it up, then we can now subject those interpretations and theories and models to rational criticism. And what survives is, Popper and Deutsch would say, is knowledge, objective knowledge, and and there's objective progress there. But postmodernists would deny that.
People actually accuse Popper of being a postmodernism or leaving the door open to postmodernism, because what Popper brings to the table is an admission of the truth that we're all fallible. So we are going to actually have different interpretations of reality. What the postmodernists layer on top of that, and they're not really building on Popper, of course, these were independent things, and Popper had a whole bunch of criticisms of them. But the postmodernists take that simple truth that we're going to disagree about reality of necessity and say, therefore, there is no truth because we all have our own truth. So there's no objective truth. Therefore, there's no actual reality to talk about because we all have our own models of reality. But what Popper says is not quite. In fact, what is going on, our circumstance is it's always possible for us to be wrong, objectively wrong, because there's something to be wrong about. The reality exists, and so you can make mistakes about it. The very thing that the postmodernists want to deny, that there is this objective reality there, that you can create objective knowledge about. And so Popper, I hate to use the word build upon because Popper is not a foundationalist, but basically the philosophy arises out of that idea. The admission that there's an objective reality, and then you can create objective knowledge about that reality, which can be improved indefinitely over time. And that leads to Deutsch's view that not only can it be improved indefinitely over time, but there's an infinite capacity for us personally to do this, and civilizationally as well. So it's that whole optimistic worldview layered on top of Popper's critical rationalist worldview.
Well, could I go into bat for the postmodernists here? Just from I'm playing devil's advocate here, put it that way. Precursor to the postmoderns are pragmatists. And so if we're looking at a perfect situation and a controlled situation, like in the academy, well, I think you can have what you're talking about in the academy. But then if we start moving that knowledge and that attempt to gain some kind of distribution of this truth to wider society through, say, media or film or all sorts of the kind of informational distribution channels, it gets very, very messy very, very quickly. And then you have the power players intervening and what would you say, bending the truth to their practical ends, toward their interests. And so this is an interesting thing, because I make sociological observations about the world in front of me, particularly the internet. I think the internet's a postmodern medium, and I think that the postmodern frame is very useful for the internet, because that's the way that the information is being distributed, and that is the way that information moves through your average human. And so I don't want to kill the ideal. I think that you guys are 100% correct, and I think that it is the best case scenario in which all this stuff's happening, and I'd love to have an optimistic view. But looking at it sociologically, it's like, how would we move toward that? And I think that, just as an aside, your work with street epistemology is a kind of evangelical Popperism or something like that. It's trying to teach people how to be more rational on actually going to the individual level and then teaching people, which is part of the liberal project, right? Like to create a rational thinking populace, which is great. Got nothing against that. I think it's the way to go. But in some sense, we haven't been creating the liberal subject for quite some time because of the capture of our educational system, and so we find ourselves in a position where it would be interesting to figure out how many people can discern and understand the epistemological arts on a ground level. And so this is my apologetics for the postmoderns in a practical sense. Maybe I'm more pragmatist in that sense, because I'm not making ontological claims, I'm making sociological ones.
You're saying our material or sociological environment is shaping people to be basically postmodernists, and they're not going to be potentially rational in this day and age due to all this technology and the internet and AI generated videos with both now video and audio. Who's to know what's real there's a lot
and all
up
the
against
players
it.
in
Yeah.
between you. There are
Yes.
state actors. There are.
propaganda.
I think that there is very little organic culture or truth circulating. It's extremely difficult to get the bottom of any kind of story right now. I would say it's the propaganda is almost complete. When you look into your phone or even mainstream media, I've worked for them. It's not. It's a very fixed perspective that is melting underneath the weight of the internet. And so I might be overly cynical at this stage, but that's how I view the landscape. And obviously from the perspective of without having read his work, someone like Deutsch, who you're a big fan of, it's like how do you evangelize that? How do you educate the public so we might actually be able to fix ourselves onto something more objectively true and therefore calming as well? Sorry, because it's...
Well, of course, I can't speak for David and what Popper would say about our present circumstance. I don't know exactly, but in terms of, let's say, the ideological capture that we have going on, the reason why it works is because the overwhelming majority of people in the academy, man on the street, still has operating on their mind this version of epistemology, completely false, but which is basically defer to the authorities. And so if your parents tell you something is true, it's true. If the Holy Book says it's true, it's true. If the experts in the academy say it's true, it's true. And that's most people's default epistemology. So it does take some work, some time, except, I should say, and Reid will know this very well, that people are Popperian in the areas where they excel. Everywhere else, they're kind of this authoritarian thing. Because everyone knows that in order to improve, you have to go through this process of trial and error or variation and selection. So in order to evangelize the Popperian view, beyond doing this kind of thing, somehow or other, there has to be the educational institutions are ground zero for this thing.
Primary.
And so Popper, like Ayn Rand, like a bunch of iconoclastic thinkers who are very much anti-institutional in the sense that they are anti-authority and they spoke against the academy while they were alive. They wrote all sorts of withering things about the academy, which is one of the reasons they're not really taught, because who wants to explain to their own university students that their very own existence is in some way fraught because they're indoctrinating the people in front of them? How do you teach non-indoctrination, or how do you teach disobedience and creativity, that kind of thing? That's what David Deutsch often says, is we should have lessons on disobedience. What would be the first thing to do in a lesson on disobedience? Get up and walk out of the lecture hall? I don't know.
That's funny.
Yeah, interesting paradox. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it is just that's the way it should be. And I kind of, back to being cynical, it's a mess right now. But I do see what you mean, as in the defer to authorities. I think that's actually is quite interesting from a sociological perspective, because that's a huge problem, and a lot of people would say that that's an asset. So you're not of that camp, the kind of in the environment that we have, right, where there is so much noise and so much difficulty discerning what is true. The kind of Harris type perspective is that we need to defer. We need to fall back to a defensive position, which is the authorities, and so that's his perspective on it. From what do we do about this problem? And there's a practical reason for that, right? Like, it's mayhem out there. I don't happen to agree with him. I think that we're going through a growth period where if we can kind of pin down the epistemology better, we come out of this stronger than we were prior to the internet. But that's just a hope, really, because it is getting wild at the moment.
There's a bunch of subtleties here that, in terms of relying on the authorities, you can sort of reframe that into relying on the knowledge within existing institutions or successful traditions, for example. Some cultures are absolutely more successful than others. And as we were talking about the other day, it's quite often the case that a tradition or a culture itself is far more wise than the individual, any one individual within it. It's figured out in explicit ways for people to flourish, which is why I'm not purely anti-authoritarian in the sense of just let's reject all of our traditions, political institutions, and so on and so forth, because that way lies chaos, which is why I think when people talk about anarchy, for example, all the work is kind of ahead of them, because it seems as if the Anglosphere, the West more broadly, has figured out something really, really difficult that didn't exist for the overwhelming majority of human history. The overwhelming majority of human history is a story of nothing but stagnation, stasis, people eking out an existence on the African savannah, dying of disease, not making any progress in technology or anything like that. But somehow our present successful nations around the world, the Western culture and so on, that enables rapid progress that is also stable. Now, I cannot, I don't think anyone can write you a book about, which has a recipe in it, for how to impose this on some other culture that doesn't yet have it. And the reason for that is, we could tell you some things. You want free speech, you want democracy, you want some form of the ability to create wealth rapidly, but those things are the explicit things. There's a whole bunch of inexplicit things that I can't put into words about how people relate to one another, about how they engage with trade or with nations that don't actually have those traditions. And so this is why I would say, you know, for example, people that are revolutionaries inside the academy and that kind of thing, they've got it wrong because they don't realise that this is a unique circumstance we find ourselves in. That you can't just do away with it all, because what you will end up with is the default position for what we had in human history, which is a tribal, violent, pretty awful kind of society. So we've discovered something. But what that thing is that we've discovered, we can only give the most scant outline of at the moment.
Well, would you call it a discovery, or this is we're heading into kind of right-wing discourse at the moment, because something I've noticed is that these kind of critical theorists are critiquing Western civilization. They do it via identities, white male, so on and so forth. But essentially, they're critiquing our cultural inheritance.
Yes.
There's something organic about that. Do you know what I mean? So they're critiquing it as, they say, systems. It's a system of power, and they critique it as a system. And in some sense, this is kind of ideological glasses, because what they're looking at is an inherited and evolved set of beliefs and practices and behaviors and traditions.
Yes.
They're working insofar as you can, as we are blank slates. So it works insofar as we are blank slates, because there is a part of us that's malleable, and they're using all of our institutions to drag us into the direction and to kind of recreate the human mind in order to create some kind of equity. And that's their totalitarian enterprise here. But you see it's not quite working, because it's the memes that are within us are actually inherited, many of them, and there's something organic there that you can't manipulate.
The master meme of the Enlightenment, or the fundamental idea that you don't want to do away with, is a tradition of criticism. Now, this is really key, and I think what the anti-Enlightenment people don't quite get, they're critiquing the Enlightenment, which is all well and good, but the one thing that distinguishes this particular tradition from other traditions is the fact that it is a tradition of change. What does tradition normally mean to people? It means those set of things that we keep the same. People celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or Ramadan every year, they go through the same rituals. This is what keeps cultures in place, reasonably robust and resilient and similar over time. But only in the Enlightenment, following on from the British Enlightenment, generally called the West, and anyone can join the West. I would regard South Korea as being part of the West, for example. Only in those places where you have a tradition of criticism, where, in a sense, all ideas are up for grabs, except for that one. You don't want to do away with the tradition of criticism. You don't want to say, we shouldn't be allowed to criticise anything, because you do away with that idea, now suddenly you're in a realm of tyranny and dogmatism, where there are certain ideas held immune from criticism. But the key thing about our tradition is we want to preserve that. And that's what enables progress, that's what enables improvement, and objective progress as well. It doesn't mean that it's inevitable, it doesn't mean that things can't go wrong, they will. But I think that when people do begin to critique Western civilization, or they say that even defending Western civilization, the Enlightenment, is somehow right-wing, they've misunderstood the fact that all progress occurs in only ever one way, which is by conjecturing a better idea and criticising the older, worse ideas or the existing ideas that you have. And I think that these other things, whether it's woke or critical theory or Marxism, for example, they do hold themselves, we've already mentioned this, immune from criticism. They don't want to be critiqued, whereas Western civilization says, no, critique away, but just don't take away our ability to continue to criticise and improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at least not critiqued from the outside. They may have their own internal standards to critique themselves, because that's how it kind of evolved.
Well, that's calling Western civilization the Enlightenment could be seen as quite reductive, because you've got religious traditions in there. You've got, you know, it's Greece, Rome, Catholicism. You've got all sorts of stuff in there, and there's aspects of that kind of religious inheritance that can't be critiqued. Like it doesn't work underneath a microscope. And I think that that's where you get a lot of this kind of right-wing backlash, is that to try to understand that tradition from a rationalist perspective is to kill it. And so conservative, they're trying to conserve that aspect of Western civilization, which is central. How do you square that? How do you square that against preserving a culture and not just preserving the kind of rationalist, scientific aspect of it? Or do you believe anything that can't stand a kind of rational critique, to hell with it, because it's useless anyway? Is that is that your position?
In a sense, yes. I don't think anything should be held off the table in terms of criticism. Everything should be able to be criticised, and if you're going to hold on to something like Smaug the dragon on top of his pile of gold and say, you can't touch this, you can't go anywhere near this, this is to be held immune from criticism because it can't be improved, this is my sacred cow, then I'm very wary of you. Popper had this quip, which was, the doctrine that the truth is manifest is the root of all tyranny, which is exceedingly deep when you think about all the ways in which it can be applied. If someone in science says, or some scientist says, I've got the ultimate laws of physics already, it's manifestly true to me that this particular set of laws of physics, Newton's theory of gravity, is the truth, then that's a form of tyranny, because they will pass it on to their students and say, you teach your students when they come around, this is also the truth. It can never be improved. There's no possible way of improving it. And so what I'm trying to articulate here, and what Deutsch gives us, I think, is an explanation of why some cultures and traditions succeed and some fail. He puts it Popper put it in terms of the open society and the closed society. Deutsch builds on that and says, well, in fact, you can reconceive this idea of the open society as the dynamic society, as opposed to a static society, which basically doesn't change over time. There might be small changes, but given any one person's lifetime, they won't notice much in the way of change. So we go back 2,500 years in Australia, the Indigenous people there, they would have been born, raised and died in exactly the same culture, not noticing much in terms of change. But of course, we notice rapid change almost every single year. Every single year a new iPhone comes out, a new Tesla is produced, political institutions are overturned. We expect the change. And, I'm beating a dead horse now, but although we're all familiar with it, and I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar with it, the overwhelming majority of humans that have ever existed would find that absolutely ridiculous. They expected one day after the next, 1 year after the next to seem exactly the same way. Now, how do we explain this? And I think it comes down to deeply embedded philosophies. Philosophies that don't have a left-wing or a right-wing nature to them, because they're the philosophies that have allowed, for example, the scientific revolution. Why is it that we've managed slowly over time to improve our knowledge in chemistry, geology, biology, physics, all of the sciences? Well, it's only because people have been willing to say, hey, I've got an idea, and other people are willing to say, I can tell you about why that's wrong. And in fact, let's go out and do an experiment. Let's test it against reality. And then slowly over time, very incrementally, we manage to improve things. Works in science, works in politics, political systems, morality. We just slowly, gradually, incrementally figure out what is true, not absolutely or finally true, by eliminating errors, by figuring out what is wrong, identifying an error and saying, okay, that's a mistake, let's fix it up. And then we've got something better and we can build on top of it. It's like common sense to most people, but again, as I say, most people never knew this. But if only they could have, if only they had the notion they could have improved, that you know, the sickness could have been cured, that they could have been warmer at night, they could have lit up their homes or their caves at night time, but they couldn't even conceive that it was possible. I think they thought, well, this is just nature, this is just the human condition, the world is the way that it is. And today, modern instantiations of that, we know it by the way in which they treat their own people. You know, Islamist cultures, you know, the worst of the Taliban or the worst of whoever happens to be ruling parts of Afghanistan at the moment, that is a perfect example of what can go wrong when, again, you think that you've got the truth manifest. Tyranny takes over.
So this is interesting, because then we can take this to, so what you're saying rings true to me from the sciences that are dealing with matter. So what, in terms of your definition of progress here is economic progress, technological progress, progress in medicine. We can go on and on, and I think it's objectively true that this is progress, because life is better with these tools that we create and breakthroughs, medicine, so on and so forth. Life was a lot worse before we had all this stuff, but it gets a bit strange when we start talking about social progress. Because what is social progress? Once you start talking about social progress, it's like social progress to where? Where are we progressing to? And this is where my I guess, reluctance to go in with a lot of these kind of open societies type perspectives, and you can correct me if I'm using that out of term, but I know that a lot of people are using Popperian perspectives to do, I think he talks about not utopian social engineering, but it's piecemeal social engineering. Is that what he says? So there is an aspect of social engineering afoot there, and you might be able to elaborate, defend what I'm going on here, but we're talking about social engineering at some point. And so if we're talking about social progress, then we're talking about political. And so it's like, who's in charge of that social progress? And so is progress snipping ourselves off from our inherited wisdom traditions, which are the religions? So I think that part of our progress, from my perspective, is that we've had what would you say? It's a moral tradition that has worked quite well. I'm not in line with the hardcore new atheists on this at all. I think that I come from a Catholic background, and they're kind of how would you say, more at ease with scientific discoveries. I think a moral tradition has moved when Western civilization it's at its best, is when our moral tradition is moving quite in concert with our scientific and Enlightenment tradition, and they're working well together. And so.
In fact,
that's an opinion, but that is my opinion.
And many people will say that moral truth or moral knowledge, perhaps better, moral explanations, are logically...
Moral technique, maybe, if we're thinking from pragmatist point of view?
It's logically prior. You need a set of good moral, call them principles, rules, ideas, before you ever make any scientific progress.
Yeah.
It comes before. You need certain values. You need to value evidence. You need to value logic. You need to value the fact that someone else has done an experiment and can do an experiment that has shown you to be wrong. All of that is not a scientific claim about the world. They're moral claims about the world, about what you should do. But you say, like, who should be in charge of this? And, like, how do we decide on, I think you're getting at, like, who would set the rules if we do away with religion? I agree with you that
someone has to dictate where, if we're looking at something like the concept of social progress, someone has to define progress. And I would describe a lot of the things that I've been critiquing in the university, this critical theory stuff and intersectionality. This is a theory of progress, because our society, our liberal society, is very hungry for ideas of different kinds of progress that it can put through our managerial government systems. And I think that these disciplines have created theories of progress which I think are deranged, and move them through the managerial systems to create some kind of totalitarian an attempt at thinking that pure equity on every facet, even right down to the way we think and judge people around us, is social progress. And I think that's morally deranged. And so I'm at a point now. It's like, the academy is very responsible for defining. It comes up with the theories of progress on all fronts, even social. The humanities became this, how would you say, repository of people thinking about what it means to create social progress. And it went awry, and now we're living downstream of that. And so it'd be interesting to, you were about to say, you were about to make a comment on what I was saying about who is in charge of social progress. I think from an observational point of view, I think a lot of people in the academy have been in control of who, and that's why it is a frontier of the culture war.
This is central to the meme war I'm interested in waging, is destroying this, whatever, critical theory conception of progress. Popper and Deutsch have the best theory of progress.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
I want to, destroy the critical theory, the intersectional, the communist conception and memeplex of progress, because I think that is a meme on the dissident right, that liberalism leads to communism, this globo homo degeneracy, tyrannical world that we're seem to be creeping along to. I think because the academy has been captured, and that central idea of how to make progress. This is very tied to people's then, religious, secular religion type situation. It
is filling the void of the moral traditions.
Yeah,
so
that fills
our
the
moral
void.
inheritance.
Also, this fills the void too, which is interesting.
Sorry, can you say that again?
The Popper Deutsch philosophy, critical rationalism.
Yeah.
It basically feels it's an option to fill the void.
Well, this is interesting, and I want you to enlighten me on this, because I'll tell you why I'm reluctant, and I've only recently picked this. It's probably a bit before we should be having this conversation. I think down the track we might have to have another one. I've picked up Open Societies and its Enemies, which is a book that I think has had a profound effect on the culture. I think it might be one of these foundational books. Put it this way, I've just started it, but I would say that someone like George Soros naming his, from my perspective, deranged foundation after this book and after his love of Karl Popper isn't warming me to this perspective. But that being said, I don't know it, so I'd be interested to see you kind of defend or elaborate maybe on what it means, what social progress means in their paradigm.
Well, firstly, on George Soros' invocation of the Open Society and its enemies. Popper generated knowledge in philosophy and knowledge about political systems and knowledge about epistemology, knowledge about knowledge. What people do with that is a whole other question. It doesn't change the truth of it or the way in which they might warp it. It's the same way that Einstein discovered basically most of what we now use, nuclear physics, relativity and that kind of thing. That some people used his theory in order to generate energy in nuclear reactors is one thing. That some people decided to build nuclear weapons and drop them on people is a whole other thing. But it's not Einstein's fault that this reality was there to discover. And in the same way that Popper explained how best to he had certain ideas about how to best organise society. that some people decide to use this in order to undermine what I'm calling the Enlightenment and what other people are calling the Enlightenment doesn't change the truth of what is actually there in Popper. I would say that it's a bastardization or a warped version of Popper is what George Soros is using. For example, Popper's conception of, we're talking about social progress. Now, I don't know how to define social progress. And I don't know that anyone would have a good definition of social progress. And because of that, the best we can do is to allow lots of different people to come up with their ideas and we criticize those ideas. Where you get actual authority and the ability to use force is at the governmental level. And so what you want there is a democratic institution. And this is also where conservatives get things completely wrong. They don't like the word democracy. Often in America I hear, the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. And I think, well, you don't understand what the word democracy means, because what many people think democracy means is what Plato wrote down 2,500 years ago, and they think that's black and white written in the book, and therefore that's true. Democracy meaning rule by the demos, rule by the people, rule by the mob, which is why Plato argued against it and said, well, you need philosopher kings because the mob can't be trusted to make rules of any sort. And so Popper came along and said, well, what we want, in fact, is a system of government where the rules and the rulers that make them can be removed without violence, efficiently, quickly, so on and so forth. And that's what the measure of democracy is. And insofar as your democratic institutions are able to facilitate that, the removal of your president, politicians, senators, whatever it happens to be, to change the rules of the game, then that enables you to make social progress in some way, shape or form. Because you're not trying to ever say, this person will have all the answers and they're going to define for you what social progress is. Social progress is at least able to happen in this condition. It's never guaranteed, in the same way that science is never guaranteed to find the truth or the final ultimate, laws of chemistry or something like that. This system will never guarantee that you're going to make social progress. But what it does is it enables the possibility for it, whatever form that happens to be. But if you decide to go down any other road, anything other than democracy, and to say either we're going to have no government institutions whatsoever, or we're going to have a tyrant in place or a communist style government like in China who is going to tell you what social progress is, that way lies chaos and the absolute opposite, because that guarantees the opposite to social progress. I can't guarantee social progress, but I can guarantee the end of social progress, which is implementing a tyranny or implementing something which doesn't allow us to change the person who is coming up with the theory for social progress. And I think that's one of the most important things about the systems that unite our countries with the United States, or I should say Australia, with the United States, with England, with all the great democracies of the world, is that you can elect a ridiculous person or a ridiculous group of people who might have power for a while. But if it's a robust, good system, then you can replace that person and that set of rules and that idea and try out something new. And that's the only way we can make progress. And we should expect things to go bad sometimes, but in the expectation that being human beings, we want to solve our problems. We want to improve. And this optimistic view of what people are, that they really do want to make things better. And even the people who are completely wrong about the way in which society should be run, nonetheless, my sense is, except for a small rounding error of people that really do want to completely destroy society or completely undermine everything, even the people that have the wrong idea, that kind of think, oh, we need a little bit more, I don't know, more taxation. We need more police out on the street beating immigrants. We need, name your bad idea, the bad social idea. Even they want to make progress, even though they've got the wrong idea. And so as long as we allow for the possibility of making mistakes, that means we can have the possibility for progress.
I still, my brain goes 404 kind of failure when it's just around the concept of social progress, because I believe there's something organic there, and there's a curation of the social world and culture, and I think there should be a preservation. There should be we really need to hang on to the things that worked, and also just to have some kind of continuity with the people that we inherited the culture from. I think all these things are really, really good, and so I think a lot of the problems now and a lot of the the theories of progress. I think it's moved too quickly, and so I'm very, very sympathetic to the conservative arguments on this and the religious arguments on this, just because I do believe we're in the year zero thing doesn't work. Do you know what I mean? I think that we've had an attempt at year zero, and a lot of people are living in year zero brain. Like, I think throughout the 2010s, the internet created a situation where you could capture people's brains and snip them off from any cultural inheritance before. So a lot, especially in my field, when you're hanging around filmmakers and creative people, they have year zero brains. And I think a lot of people are that way inclined now. And so I guess I wasn't making, it was just a comment on my difficulty with the concept of social progress. Because what is that? What is that?
Yeah,
equality? It's not equity. Equality, what are we talking about when we're talking about social progress? Because one group's definition of social progress is very, very different from another's.
Yeah, I mean, it's open to whatever people think, and people are open to give a potential new conjecture about what we should do. You know, the problem of what we should do next is basically what morality is, and there's a lot we could do, but not everything that we could do we should do. So we have to criticize these ideas and figure out where to go.
Well, I think part of the problem is the massification of everything. I think the mass media is if one good thing comes out of the internet, it might be the fracturing. And I know that sounds strange, but to have one central point of cultural production and then distribution, it doesn't allow for the curation of certain cultures. And so I think that is potentially where we're heading, like a fracturing of media might actually turn into a fracturing of people living in distinct ways. So I think that this whole, what we're talking, the strange globo homo thing, I think that's a very, it's a last ditch effort for the completely global, centralized culture. And I think that the trends are, although it seems very scary, the fractionation and the fighting that's going on, the trends seem to be towards enclaves, cultural enclaves, in which we actually have a chance to test which cultures are outperforming others on many, many different metrics. But insofar as we've got a singular, massified culture, I think that then you've got the ability for that. People with the theories for social progress to take some kind of control.
I couldn't agree with you more. Like when you say that, you know, what exists now and works we want to preserve. Absolutely. It's the same kind of argument that goes on in science. You want to be able to rely on our best explanations now in order to create new medicines, find new chemicals, whatever it happens to be, build a rocket to get to the moon, whatever it happens to be. You've got to rely on your best existing stuff right now. It's no point saying, let's do away with it all and just improve it, because that's the business of scientists, and it's an extremely hard one. And again, as I was saying before, that in our existing institutions, we want to preserve them precisely because they contain knowledge. They contain knowledge, the most important of which is how to allow for progress over time, which is stable. And progress is not what progressives tend to think that it is. And so I understand how uncomfortable you are with, like, and I share this uncomfortable sense that progressives seem to talk about progress as any sort of random chaotic change. And so that's not objective progress. So what is progress? Well, it's almost like that old thing, I can't remember who said it, but you know, what is pornography? I know it when I see it, kind of thing. So we understand far, far less, obviously, about societies, even individual human psychology, as compared to physics and chemistry, that kind of thing. They're more easily tested.
It's like the progressives have the commandment of, like, thou shalt deconstruct hegemonic power. It's the top thing to do. Mm-hmm. This is stupid. You know, there's a better way to get towards, you know, to progress as a society, which is just to conjecture and criticize ideas, and it just because it comes from a white straight man doesn't mean that it's by default, you know, bad or immoral. So, and these religious traditions, people are allowed in free societies to believe whatever they want. They can hold on to these things. They can pursue the good in whatever way they want. But, you know, we don't need to tear down these things, you know, from this perspective.
I found it very interesting watching you talk about preserving knowledge, because you're making very conservative arguments. I saw a conservative talking there. We've inherited discoveries. We've inherited this giant body of knowledge, and is this beautiful thing there is no price you can put on it. And this is how people feel about their religious traditions as well. Is that you don't. I'm holding on to this, and I just found it very interesting, because I do agree with you. It's that is an inheritance. I think a lot of what's happening is this hyper progressive critique or year zero mindset that comes from time to time. We've seen year zero tried, and quite a few times in history, or some variation of it. French Revolution, Mao's China. The worst one is Pol Pot. He actually coined the phrase year zero. It is interesting that people, I would assume, are very, very progressive. These kind of, you know, liberal people are now in the position of being conservatives. They're trying to conserve our body of knowledge and traditions in many ways, liberal traditions. It's funny.
It's those two words, especially in the United States, are so fraught. I mean, liberal often means quite authoritarian. Anything other than, you know, someone who has a worldview that tends towards libertarianism. And progressive, the same idea, I would argue, that it's, again, a form of like newspeak. They've repurposed a piece of language which otherwise would have been useful for us to all agree on what the meaning or the sense of this word happens to be. But, you know, as Karl Popper says, one cannot speak in such a way that they cannot be misunderstood. So it doesn't matter how you try and explain yourself, someone's always going to misunderstand you, or Deutsch would say, all words are going to be ambiguous to some extent. And so when I talk progress, I mean, you can only ever either say this is the definition and this is the truth of the matter, or end up in some sort of circularity. So talking about progress, I can point to examples. I can say, look, progress in science means that when we use something like general relativity, then I can, using a GPS system, find your position on the globe down to the nearest millimeter or something like that. But if I was to use another theory like Newton's theory, I might get it to the nearest kilometer or something like that. So that's objective progress, from any man's wild guess about where you are on the planet to Newton's to Einstein's. But when it comes to society, aside from pointing at this society is making progress in science and technology and medicine more rapidly than that society, therefore that society is socially more progressive than this society, I don't think I can define it, and I wouldn't get hooked on trying to define it other than saying social progress must exist in a good sense of the word. There must be a way in which we can say things can improve over time. Christianity has improved over time, I would argue. We wouldn't want to return to the witch-burning era, for example. That was some dark days. But now, whatever Catholicism is now, is, I would argue, objectively better than back in the Inquisition.
So I think a lot of people would say that there's peaks and troughs. It's not this kind of linear. I think that's probably the more conservative perspective, right? It's this kind of where my brain for it falls, because it's not linear progress. It's peaks and troughs. We find ourselves in better times and using biblical teachings better.
You know, the stock market sort of curve.
Yeah. Oh, you said there's a trend in your estimation. Yeah, I guess we're not sacrificing, for instance, isn't happening anywhere on the planet, I don't think, or maybe in some strange little corners, but not at the rates it did in the past. Yeah, that is interesting. So I did have a point about the return of the strong gods which is a critique of this is a guy named R.R. Reno. He's critiquing Popper really centrally. Are you familiar with that book? I guess the main thesis is that Popper had a very, very big effect on our current culture and our current academy. And while he would be horrified at the current state of the academy, and he says that explicitly, a lot of his ideas of have influenced. So I guess this is a more broadly. I won't just talk about our arena. I think more broadly, the conservatives see a continuation between kind of liberal centrism, classical liberalism, and the people who espouse to be classical liberalism, and whatever this woke monster has become. And I'm sympathetic to that, just because wandering, so I can take the kind of James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose perspective, where there's a clear demarcation from this Marxian monster and classical liberalism. But what I can't square off is walking through the halls of universities and our media institutions and speaking to people, because a lot of them would call themselves classically liberal, but have slowly been their core concepts have been moved inch by inch for them to be morally in this deranged woke mindset. So it's very, very hard to demarcate who is actually a classical liberal and who is woke here. Would you agree that there's no? I would say that woke is to classical liberalism as ISIS is to Islam. Do you know what I mean? There is a level of responsibility that should be taken, and just like the I guess new atheists used to critique anyone who was Islamic for ISIS and say you have to take some sort of responsibility. I think that might be true of this humanist ISIS, because it is a deranged. Like, if you speak to a person who's Islamic, they would say that ISIS and these more militant forms of Islam are complete misunderstandings of the foundational texts, which is something that a lot of like classical liberals or Popperians would be saying also.
I think where the analogy may fall down is that in Islam you do have a text, and you can point to passages in the text. This is something that someone like Sam Harris will do endlessly. There is a plausible story that you can get from the Quran that the Taliban is doing the right thing according to what is written in the holy books. Cover your women, spread the word by the sword, etc., etc., enumerate all the bad ideas that are there. Now, can the same be done with Locke and Hume and the texts that are normally associated with the beginnings of liberalism, John Stuart Mill and so on and so forth, that would give you a plausible explanation to justify being a proponent of woke. A proponent of woke, I would think, is some kind of modern instantiation of someone who wants to destroy the means of error correction. They want to say, we've got a set of dogma that you're not able to challenge. If you challenge it, you're a racist, you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe, and so on and so forth. This is the way in which we're going to have our utopia. Whereas I would have thought the classical liberals were quite anti-utopian, especially in the British tradition. They were all about saying, we don't know how to best have a society, how to best run a society. So all we can do is to set up the conditions where people can make their own choices, because there is no final end state. There's no perfect communist, commune, Marxist ideal that's going to be out there, which is Popper's whole point. Those are dead ends, because although people like Marx thought that, well, here's a political system that is scientific, he also thought there was a kind of an end point to progress. This is the ideal, whereas Popper critiques that and says that there is no such ideal. Again, the democracy thing, all we can do is to set up a situation where you can have systems in place which allow for rules and rulers to be discarded, in the same way that scientific theories can be discarded once something better is proposed.
So the very lack of an endpoint is where this woke stuff has moved in. And so I think that would be where the meat in the critique is that in the absence of a moral vision something will gain power and move into it. So I guess this comes to the kind of the paradox in Popper, which is open societies and its enemies. What is one to do about its enemies? I'm interested to figure out how he squares that, because it is a paradox, right? It's like, how do you have this open society while suppressing the forces of the strong gods, as Reno would say?
Well, you certainly don't tolerate the intolerant. This is often held up as you absolutely, you want to stop the tyrants. You want to ensure that arbitrary violence doesn't happen. All of these things, I think, are part of a conception that you get out of something like the open society and its enemies. The open society does not mean anything goes, which would be an anarchist case for the way in which to organise society. Again, it values existing traditions. It says that incremental progress is possible on the existing traditions that we have, which may very well be the best ones that we know of at the moment, in order to ensure that people are able to flourish and create wealth rapidly and that kind of thing. But it doesn't mean that we have found the end point. And having the moral vision, absent an end point, absent saying here's the ideal that we're moving towards, is, I don't think, a criticism of this particular worldview. Because that would be like saying that unless in physics you can specify what the final laws of physics are going to look like, that's somehow a critique of physics itself. Well, of course it's not. Physics is just about trying to find ever better explanations of physical reality. And so you just transpose that over to the political realm or the moral realm and say, I don't know what the end point is, because there is no end point. All I can offer up from Popper is to say things can get better. Things could also get worse, but hey, there's the possibility that if you follow this very general process, which we call conjecture and refutation, that you can, with a lot of effort, manage to find some truth scientifically, politically, morally, over time. You can make missteps, and the things can fall to ruin if you make the wrong choices, but there's always the possibility of making better choices, possibility of making progress. And anyone who stands up and says, I've got the recipe for the utopia, well, we need to start criticising them. Not to say that they haven't got a good idea, but to say that their good idea cannot possibly be improved upon, I'd really, really worry.
Mm.
Yeah, I mentioned this phrase in another conversation that, the religions of the past are kind of humanity's moral training wheels or metaphysics training wheels, but this, this critical rationalism, Enlightenment way of doing things, there's a risk for sure of getting rid of what actually makes civilization not go extinct, next week, if we start thinking about, oh, this may be wrong in some piece of it. But that's the risk we're taking, and I think we're making progress. We have made progress, and I'm not gonna go back to some authoritarian philosophy or religion just because it has some good things that we should preserve. Anything that I want to preserve, I can make a good explanation. There's good explanations for it that I can come up with, and you're also free to critique those explanations. But I think I have a reasonable defense of them. It's not completely open and nothing is completely arbitrary. So we can talk about things and make progress that way. Anyway, anything else to chat about for now?
No, I think it was interesting. Yeah.
Sweet. All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can find Brett at Talkcast, right?
Podcast, www.bretthall.org. All the links are there.
Yep. You can find Mike on Substack.
michaelnayna.com, and you'll end up at my Substack, where I explore these ideas and make films and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
All right, great. Keep watching.